Yaroslav Hrytsak is one of Ukraine's leading historians and public intellectuals. His recent book, in Ukrainian, Overcoming the Past, A Global History of Ukraine, became a bestseller. His English-language book, Ukraine, The Forging of a Nation, is now a key reference work on Ukrainian history. We met in Lviv to discuss the global dimension of Ukrainian history and the features of Ukraine's political culture that explain why the country has so often fought against tyranny. You're listening to the Explaining Ukraine podcast. Explaining Ukraine is produced by UkraineWorld, an English-language media project about Ukraine run by Internews Ukraine. My name is Volodymyr Yermolenko. I am a Ukrainian philosopher, editor-in-chief of UkraineWorld, and president of PEN Ukraine. This episode is made in partnership with Kyiv-Mohyla Academy and the project Heritage Ukraine, supported by the European Union's Erasmus program. Before we begin, a quick reminder: you can support our work on Patreon. Your contributions are vital. We rely heavily on crowdfunding. You can also help fund our volunteer trips to frontline areas in Ukraine, where we support both civilians and soldiers. Donations are welcome via PayPal. You'll find all the relevant links in the episode description. So let's begin. Yaroslav Hrytsak, welcome to this podcast.
Pleasure, always pleasure meeting you or having you.
You are famous for your attempt to write Ukrainian history from the global perspective. And let me ask you, what is this element or elements that make Ukrainian history interesting to the wider world?
There is such a belief among historians doing global history that you could write global history practically of everything, of every country. There is already German global history, or global history of Germany, there is global history of France. So this sense, it makes perfect sense to make a global history of Ukraine. But still, if we are Ukrainian historians focus on global history of Ukraine, I believe this makes sense in the time of crisis. Because we're looking for some solutions, for some answers for a crisis, which is both Ukrainian and global. And in this case, if you look for answers, global perspective is probably the most handy in this sense. So it's not a luxury, it's a necessity, I would say.
If you look at the Ukrainian history in the 20th century and primarily the global wars, the world wars, which were directly related to Ukraine, can we say that actually Ukrainian history was always global, and it was very global in the 20th century, but it was provincialized by the imperial look, by the external look at it?
There are two words that historians are not that much willing to say or to utter.
It's always?
Always and never.
Yeah.
Yes, in 20th century it was. There's a book written by Dominic Levin in 2014, a few weeks after Maidan, and he's making this kind of footnote that my conclusion has been written before Maidan. Maidan has no effect on his thesis, but his point is he was writing about the collapse of the Russian Empire. And the opening sentence in his book is that more than anything, the fate of the First World was dependent on Ukraine, on the Ukrainian issue. So I would say that 20th century gave a race to Ukrainian issue. Very much like 19th century was a century of the German issue, Polish issue, Italian issue. 20th century is very much the 20th issue century. Also Jewish, I would say. Probably two of the largest unresolved national issues were Ukrainians and Jewish, with a very tragic consequences in both cases. We know about the Holocaust, but we don't know that much about the sufferings of Ukrainian for a variety of reasons. But now we understand, especially when the Holodomor comes to front. But basically, thing is, you're perfectly true, that for a variety of reasons, Ukraine stood at the center of the global conflict war is in the First World War and the Second World War. There is belief among historians that very much like on the First World War, the fate of the Second World War depends on who will get control of Ukraine. And in this sense, Stalin played the Ukrainian card much more masterfully than Hitler did. If Hitler probably would encourage or make some Ukrainian state, when the war probably would have better chance to win, but then he would not be a Hitler, because exactly this Ukrainian state was not, Ukraine issue was not in his plan, so to say. But basically, it's not the first time that we know, what happens with the Ukrainian-Russian war, when we clearly see this kind of global dimension. It's not for the first time. Again, even if we move beyond the 20th century, we may find similar circumstances in the previous history, say 17th century, the 17th century crisis, Khmelnytsky uprising, which practically gave a race to progress of the Moscow state, to Russian Empire, and to European superpower. So in a sense, so there is something in Ukrainian history, namely geography, geopolitics, whatever, that makes this region very much important globally.
It's very good that you mentioned 17th century. I will ask you about that, but let me come back again to the 20th, 21st century. You mentioned Russian Empire. What if I tell you that the big ambition of Russia in the 21st century is to prove to the whole world that decolonization of the 20th century was wrong? The whole process of decolonization, de-imperialization was wrong. And as you say, Russia is impossible without Ukraine, Russian Empire.
Russia is possible without Ukraine.
But let me just finish. What if the major goal is not just to take Ukraine or to erase Ukrainian identity, but through erasing Ukrainian identity to say, okay, we are in the world of new empires and we Russians are the new empire of the 21st century?
I don't really know. Is this a kind of the way of thinking of Putin? I believe he thinks it's more simpler way. They have to restore Russia as a superpower, to make Russia great again. This is it.
But this is imperialism.
This is it. It's imperialism, because basically yes, because we believed, and wrongly so, that once Ukraine left the space, once Ukraine proclaimed independence, it put an end to the Russian Empire. It didn't. It didn't. So basically, yes, Russia could exist without Ukraine, but Russia could not exist without Ukraine as a superpower. I don't remember who said it, but he put it, I believe it was him, put it very nicely, that without Ukraine, Russia is like a Canada. With Russia, Ukraine is like the United States. This is basically about the superpower status. I remember Bogdan Havrilyshin, the name which is not that much familiar nowadays. Let me remind you, he was a member of the Roman Club. He was very much influential as an entrepreneur, as a businessman, as a manager, all kind of things, and thinker. And I remember in the 90s, he was thinking, we have a time for a decade or so, not more, because Russia would sooner or later restore its status, and first thing Russia will do will try to regain Ukraine under its control. So this one says the 90s decade was a kind of crucial in terms of capacities, whether Ukraine could stand or not this kind of the Russia reborn imperialism. I don't really like that much term of colonization empire, because it presumes that all empire were wrong empire. I believe that empire was a kind of, if may say so, normal way of organization of states throughout most of the global history. And there are empires and empires. And there was a joke among Ukrainians in Kyiv at the beginning of 20th century, why Great Britain would annex us, then in 10 years we'll be ready for independence. What I mean to say, this is not that everything is wrong about empire. It's just Russian empire was very wrong kind of empire.
Yeah, it's a long debate, because many people in Asia, in India, would not agree that Great Britain was a good empire, and they also had their own Holodomor, the artificial famine organized during the Second World War for the military reasons, and therefore, as far as I understand, for Indians, Churchill is a very bad figure. But my idea is that, okay, we can say that some empires are better than others. There is this famous phrase by Drahomanov who is saying that being socialist in Galicia, meaning the Habsburg Empire, meaning it means 6 months in prison or 3 months in prison, while being socialist in Russian Empire means 10 years of prison. So it's a big difference.
I had a friend who is a professor at Edinburgh. He is a professor in social linguistics. And he made this point at the very beginning of the war. You have many democracies that are German-speaking. You have most of the countries that are English speakers, they're still democracy, functional democracy. You could also tell it about the Spanish case. You don't have any country, Russian-speaking country, which is democracy. Yes, Indians have a right, perfectly right, to claim that British Empire was a wrong kind of empire, but still what emerged from this empire was a large democratic state, for better or worse. I believe for better, so to say. In a sense, I believe the democracy, kind of parliamentary system, all the kind of thing was very much a British invention, and it spread with the British Empire. It was a part of the British legacy. It's not the case with the Russian Empire.
Yeah.
Now, this is what I'm trying to say. I'm sorry to interrupt you, because we have to remember one important thing. Until the very end of the Russian Empire, it was not a constitutional empire.
Yeah.
The only unconstitutional empire in this continent. Even Ottoman Empire was trying to becoming a constitutional empire. Even until 1907, in Russian Empire, flogging was a kind of perfect punishment, legal punishment in the empire. So this is what I meant to say. So talking about the communism, emerging communism and some part of thought, it's not just because of the Marxism. It's because of conditions of the Russian Empire per se. So this is what I mean to say when talking about the recurrent point of the Russian history, which has been mentioned. I'm right now rereading the text of the Yuri Afanasyev. Unfortunately, name is now widely forgotten. He was one of the key leader of Perestroika. He was a historian, and you may remember or not, 2008 he wrote a large article shortly before his death, which was at the questions mark, are we not slaves? Мы не рабы? And actually we is discussing what is wrong with Russian history, why we have this recurrent pattern, either Lenin or Stalin, Grozny or Peter I, Putin, which also famous in this picture. So what I'm trying to say, it's not this much about the imperialization, decolonization. It's the colonization from the particular part of the empire, which is Russian Empire. And this is something because, again, as a global, let me just apply a global perspective. I'm under very strong impact of the Douglas North book. He's a Nobel Prize winner, economist, social violence and social order. And basically he claims that economic success depends largely to what extent any society could deal with violence, to minimize violence to some tolerant extent. And he will actually how to make this kind of categorization. In this sense, what we have is a Russian Empire, the kind of the recurrent extreme violence. It's not the case with the British Empire or even the Spanish Empire. See what I mean here? So what I mean to say is that Ukrainian case is much more complicated, is much more challenging. I know where to go from his point, but this is what I'm trying to say, because about talking about the colonization, my impression is that we simplify the matter.
I will put it in a slightly different way. I think that we can distinguish between those empires who try to develop the republican thinking inside, but they are more violent and imperial outside. And I think this is the case of Britain. This is to a lesser extent the case of France. This is the paradox of the British Empire in the 19th century. It was a liberal empire, but liberal inside and non-liberal outside. But at least it creates this tension that there are some models of political thinking and action that are developed internally, and then they are spread.
What would be chances Gandhi to survive under Stalin?
Yeah, but this
are the Nicholas the Great?
But this is my point. I'm trying to continue your thought actually, but this means that what happens in Russia is never been this kind of a cruelty outside, but more or less development of republican forms inside, right?
You used the word never.
Yeah. It was never been in history, right?
Yeah, what I mean to say that there was some kind of the attempt or moments in Russian history when Russia tries to become a normal state.
It lasted very, very short period of time.
At least at 60s, 80s, Alexander the second reforms for 20 years. Well, one of the largest period of the liberal reforms, which ended abruptly by the assassination of Alexander the Great, and it stopped, so to say. But it's large-scale and amazing reforms, military, judiciary system, all the kind of possible systems, so to say. But the irony was, by the same time when there was a liberalization of Russian Empire, at the same time there was a time when the Ukrainian Ukrainian language was forbidden twice in 63 and 67, and the most liberal regime. So what again I'm saying here, this is not my point, it's also a point of Afanasy which I mentioned, that in most of the cases, Russian liberals, they mostly stick to the empire, rather than supporting some kind of emancipation project.
I found the formula now. So the liberal, let's say liberal in quotation marks, liberal for inside but not liberal outside, European empires of the 19th century were actually saying that we are higher race, and therefore we deserve democracy because we know how to be free. While the nations we colonize are lower race, and they do not know how democracy functions. Whereas the Russian form is to say violence is the only form of government. I call it recently thanatocracy, government by death, because you say to your citizens, I will decide when you will die. So when Ukrainians were trying to say, no, we want more liberal order, Russians are actually saying, no, the normality is violence. Even inside Russia, the normality is violence.
This was saying that in a sense, Russian Empire was a very kind of wrong empire. It's kind of peculiar empire, so to say, because it was dangerous not just for the colonized, but for colonizers. In a sense,
this is this concept.
State.
I think this is a concept by Alexander Etkin, the Russian scholar to whom I have some ambiguous attitude. But internal colonization. Do you agree with this concept?
This is not a new concept.
Sorry,
it's not a new concept.
Okay.
Those who study nations, they knew the concept was used for the first time in 70s, 80s about the Celtic fringe of the British Empire. I believe it was the name escapes me, but I easily find it, so to say. So basically, this is the point. So this is the British Empire was very much colonizing empire inside colonizer, especially for the Celtic fringe, for this kind of people.
But it's an interesting concept because basically it erases the difference between the colonizer and the colonized, and this echoes what Custine famously said about Russia, that even the highest aristocrat in Russia is like the lowest slave compared to the Tsar. And I think this idea can actually work because it shows that contrary to European empires where there is clear division between masters and slaves, in Russia you don't have this division. Basically everybody is slave.
But this boils down to the same concept of extreme violence, because extreme violence means there's only one person or few person that defines your fate, so to say.
Yeah.
And this is it. The power, the violence, the power is not restricted, and the violence is extreme by this talk. And it's exactly what makes a difference. You have the significant difference, essential difference between the British Empire and the Russian Empire, between the Polish state and the Russian Empire. The thing is that exactly when Ukrainian elites were coming to Russian Empire, They had the idea of the, so to say, limited power of the monarch. And this is what they borrowed the concept from the Polish state, because Polish state was very much, yes, was anarchistic without a doubt. But still, the idea was that nobility, they were citizens.
Yeah.
They had rights. Nobody could punish them corporally. This is what the point was. And there was, I remember this, you may know it or not, Lyskov, there was his collection of tales about the life in the Ukraine in the middle 19th century.
You mean Lyskov, the Russian writer?
Writer, yeah,
Nikolai
Lyskov. This is Khmelnytsky рассказы, which are very nice. They're funny. And basically, he describes the life of the local landlord. He's a kind of everywhere. What he has in his mind is a Heimei, but he's very proud of his Ukrainian origin, because he believes that his Ukrainian origin means a better, higher status than most of the Russian nobles. Because he says, какая у них статность, у них же каждая бабка кнутом поротая. What a status there, if their grandmother was whipped by the flock. So
yeah, this is the
crucial difference.
So the idea that the only management tool, administration tool, is violence. And the only source of power is violence, right?
Violence. And therefore, your life is not counted. Your life is not counted.
You're just replaceable.
You're just replaceable, because basically what's counted is the fate of the state, which means fate of the ruler, basically, because the rule defines.
And we have these patterns that were born not under Stalin, that were born not under Lenin, that were born not under Nicholas I. When they were born, they were actually born during the Ivan Terrible, right?
No, this is kind of great discussion. There's discussion on historians. There's no consensus. You may know or not, there was this rather influential Russian historian, Alexander Yanov, who, by the way, was born in Odessa, who was not quite a dissident, but he was very independent, and he was forced to leave the Soviet Union in the 70s, made a career in the United States, and he keeps making this point, that there was some kind of the period when Russia tries to say to move out of this pattern, and in some period he says that Russia was much more democratic than other countries. This is his point. I'm not claiming that, so to say. Because he don't see Ivan Grozny as a pattern at that time. Again, I wouldn't discuss it, but one way or another, this is one thing which is very much have to be under emphasized. This is longue durée. This didn't come in 1917, nor in the 1991 or 2014 or whatever, or 2022. This is something which has a large root. And my belief is, again, this is global. It's probably something very simplified, that to a large extent, what you have a kind of limitation of power is a very much experience or invention, if you will, of the Western world. It came not for some kind of ideological discoveries or issues, it just came from the practices. And the crucial practices was division or rivalry between the secular and sacred power, between the Roman Empire and the Pope, so to say. And since they were fighting each other, they created not one but two centers of power. And once you have two central powers which are rivals and fighting each other, they created a chance for the third actors to emerge, which independent, like independent cities, universal kind of things. The pattern of Russia was that for a long time, not for the very beginning, not in Kyiv, Rus, but in Moscow, church became a state church. And this is something which gives this kind of the pattern. Because once you have the one center of power, there's no other one, so there's no chance for the third. I believe this is a point made by Leszek Kolakowski a long time ago, who knew Russian history, Polish history, and he was very specialist in Marxism. And he also has to make sense that Marxism Bolshevism could emerge for some kind of the zero ground in Russia, because it was superimposed on this kind of the pattern where there's only one actor, which really matters. And this, I believe, something which, because basically this pattern, when the secular and sacred power is blurred, it's universal. It's a universal pattern. You most probably have it everywhere, and in every empire. I mean, before modern times, and beyond West, so to say. To a large extent, it happened in the West. It was a result of the rivalry between, as I say, Pope and the Imperial Empire. In England was a result of Magna Carta, but there was something like that. And in this sense, I believe, this is what I'm pointing, is that in this sense, Ukraine was closer to the Western part, to the Western pattern, because of the variety of reasons, but because basically Ukraine was very much peripheral, but still was part of this world, and throughout the Polish state, it was kind of embraced or inherited this pattern.
What if I agree with you, but what if I tell you a little bit different story? That, for example, the feudal fragmentation in Europe was also the factor, because when you have barons, feudals, which are not subordinate to the king, which have rights and which fight for their rights, and this is the origin of Magna Carta, this is the origin of very strong aristocratic element in the French political culture that Louis XIV tried to destroy, and French Revolution tried to destroy, but didn't destroy totally, right? And that means that when I look at the map of Europe, I see how many fortresses they have, and each fortress is basically any particular baron, any particular aristocrat. In Ukraine, it was also the case. Ukrainian space was the case where autocratic power was always very weak. It was in Great Duchy of Lithuania, it was during medieval Rus, or it was during Rzeczpospolita. It became strong only under the Muscovy, under the Russians. And another factor which is very interesting is that, when Protestants came to Europe, the Protestant political theology is to merge sacral and political power. So the ideas that the Protestants have, like Calvin and I think even Luther, is to have a religious ruler. But interestingly enough, because of the competition between Protestants and Catholics, you basically, by the 18th century, Europe went to the idea that rather we will have a freedom of speech, freedom of confession, freedom of religion. And probably it's also a Ukrainian case, because Catholics and Orthodox, and you mentioned Khmelnytsky as a kind of and you represent also the Ukrainian Catholic University, and the Greek Catholicism, right, as a kind of a synthesis. So it's not only these centers that's sacred and political, but there are also plurality of factors.
But the thing is, I believe we're talking about the same things, but a different language, so to say. Yes, basically, because the debate is how you could curtail, limit central power. In what way? So I'm saying this kind of rivalry, which gives a kind of the thrust or a push, kind of invention, kind of created a virus. And the further fragmentation, exactly, the fragmentation was because basically there is no religion that could dominate this European space. So Protestant, Catholic, then add the secularization into the 19th century, to say it was very much fragmented. In these circumstances, it's very hard, practically impossible, to have kind of the dominated, stated domination kind of thing. There was a lot of attempts, but it's never happened in Europe. But one way or another, what I'm trying to say, that Ukraine, in this sense, was closer, even so peripherally, but still was closer to the West. One of the major points which was made by Ukrainian historiography, especially this liberal historiography, by Drahoman or Lipinski, that made difference between Ukraine and Russians are not in language or not in the church, Orthodox, because basically they're very close in that sense. The basic difference is political traditions, because the relations between the state and society. Society always matters, so to say. There is no sacred attitude of the state as a kind of sacred, so to say. State was very much limited in this sense. So again, because believe Ukrainians made a very fatal decision in the middle of the 17th century to enter in this kind of the Russian sphere, which brought to the tragic consequences, but also it brought us a kind of rivalry of those two models. most of the time, or throughout the times, this model, the Russian model, they tried to wipe out these traditions, but they never disappeared. Never. So they've rarely disappeared. And every time there was a weakening of the center in Moscow or in Petersburg, you have this kind of the patterns re-emerging. Even say under 1917, the break of the Russian Empire, this kind of re-emerges of Ukrainian national state, or even after death of Stalin. I mean, this kind of re-emerging Ukrainian autonomism, or particularly under Gorbachev. So every time you have this weakening of the central power, Ukrainian factor would re-emerge, but exactly in this pattern as a kind of the specific kind of self-organizing society which tries to put its own agenda.
Yeah, I really share this reading, and it's strengths of Ukraine, but also weakness of Ukraine, because when the society is too anarchic, it's self-organizing, but at a certain moment, critical moment, it can be just not be able to be centralized enough to oppose a big aggression. And this is, I think, one of the questions today. But let me ask about this global vision of Ukraine. What if I tell you that the global meaning of Ukrainian history is the idea that regardless of the fact how tyrannies or autocratic empires will try to destroy these elements of democracy, it can last for centuries. These elements of democracy will still reappear, re-emerge when a moment comes.
That I don't know. This was the main story of Ukrainian history. Because basically, miraculously, quite often, it just re-emerged and became very strong. It's probably the shortest way to describe the 30 years of independence of Ukraine. Because at the beginning of Ukraine independence, it looks like Ukraine and Russia, there's no difference. They're much more similar society. But then quite of a sudden, they're different. Because they choose the different tracks, and basically Ukraine escaped temptation, autocracy, and they have one revolution, second revolution, and Ukraine is on different track. I lost track of my thought. So basically, you're asking about...
I'm asking about the global meaning. So what other nations, for example, can learn from Ukraine in this sense? And for me, it's precisely the re-emergence of democratic and republican way of political action in a situation when it seems to be totally impossible.
So what I'm trying to say, there are bad news and good news. The bad news is that you have this kind of violence, especially extreme violence, re-emerging from time to time. You could hardly escape it if you not solve this issue fundamentally. And this is, I believe, one of the main stories of Ukrainian history throughout the 20th century and before. Because you have this kind, when Ukraine falls in this kind of the region of the extreme violence, with anti-Semitism, all the kind of things that we know for sure, this is the bad news. And the good news is that Ukraine has managed to resist and persist, despite of this extreme violence. This is probably one of the main messages of Ukrainian history, which gives a hope, so to say. It makes sense. It makes sense to resist and to persist. Because basically extreme violence could not win. It could destroy, it could do a lot of harm. But by the end of the day, it still makes sense fighting it, so to say. And this is exactly what Ukraine now demonstrates to the whole world, because otherwise Ukraine wouldn't have a chance to stand.
What about religion? Because it's a very interesting topic. Sometimes when people look at Ukraine from the outside, they say, okay, but they are Orthodox and they should be aligned with Russia. And it's present even among the American politicians around Trump and all these, very simplistic things. How do you see the Ukrainian religious development prevents this idea that it should be part of the...
American politicians have to be reminded of early American history. That basically, during the War of Independence, one of the first acts was exactly depriving the rights of the Anglican Church over the new established American states. This is something which could be checked. You could find it was on the first act, so to say. This is more or less the same, similar story. And the other similarity here is that unlike Russia, or unlike any other European state, both in the United States and Ukraine, you don't have any single nomination which is dominant. This gives a difference, so to say, because Ukraine is extremely diverse, very much like United States. You don't have one Orthodox church, you have at least 3 Orthodox churches, which are fighting with each other for say. Plus, you have other Protestants and many denominations. I'm talking about Jews, all the kind of things. So this is exactly because, in many sense, I believe the short word for Ukraine is diversity. And the attempts of the Russian Empire and the Soviet state to impose one religion, which is most worldwide, was basically failed. This is not a Ukrainian scenario. I doubt there will be any kind of the attempt to create a Ukrainian dominant church, say, in the future or nowadays. Even so, there's probably some attempts, many people, but this is not impossible. So what I'm saying here, when we fight against the Russian church, we're not fighting against church, we're trying to restore diversity. We try to say to undermine the dominant status of one church only, which was historically for several centuries in Ukraine.
It's interesting how Ukrainians are trying to go away from this Russian myth of the Third Rome, that one Rome fell, another Rome fell, because Ukrainians say, no, one Rome is there, and therefore we have Roman Catholic Church and Greek Catholic Church. Another Rome is here, Constantinople, therefore we have Ukrainian Orthodoxy aligned to Constantinople. And coming back to this alignment with Moscow, I mean, for us, the Khmelnytsky figure is very controversial. First, because he aligned Ukraine with Muscovy. Second, because there were huge emergence of violence against Poles, against Jews. But look, I mean, and we know the attitude of Taras Shevchenko, for example, to Khmelnytsky. But wasn't the attempt of those times, and probably it's Ukrainian naivete, that, okay, we will sign something with Moscow as we will sign something with Crimean Tatars, and we will sign something with Ottomans, we will sign something with the Poles, we will sign something with the Swedes, we will sign all the kind of agreements, and we will kind of be playing this plurality. What do you think?
No, I believe I'm not the historian of the 17th century, but I read a lot. And now my friends, we're talking, we're discussing all the things, so they told me a lot about things about that. So first of all, we have to understand Khmelnytsky in the 17th century terms, not in our terms. And the 17th century terms, which was nightmare of coalitions. Because, yes, it was kind of reproduced in the 20th century, but still, because of the geopolitical importance and the little vulnerability of Ukraine, you have several large actors fighting for control of this territory. So the only way to get some, not just independence, but autonomy, is to make alliance with any of them. This is first thing. And secondly, you have to add the 17th century. When I talk about 17th century, because you have to come some legitimacy to be a leader of the state. Khmelnytsky had no legitimacy. He has no royal blood in his veins. He was just a noble. It was a pretty noble. The tragedy or drama of Ukrainian history, by the way, Russian as well, that by that time, at the 17th century, all the pretenders, the candidates of the royal blood, who could be really kind of the rulers on this territory, their dynasty, they just died out by the 17th century. In Russia, it was a crisis, so it came to Romanov, but still Romanov was related, but there was nobody in Ukraine, so to say. So what I'm trying to say, that Khmelnytsky was a military leader, not the head of the state. He was, if I may put it in this Western terms, he was a Hrytsak, not an aristocrat, not a royal blood, so to say. So he was bound to find somebody, some kind of king, a monarch, who would provide him with a kind of supermass, legitimize his power. And he was looking for this super monarch everywhere, with Swedish king, with a Moscow Tsar, with a Ottoman Sultan, all kind of things. The choice of the Moscow Tsar was to some extent kind of circumstantial, but also has a very much kind of result of some considerations, practical consideration. First of all, at that time, Moscow looked far, far away. To have Moscow was a kind of the monarch, means that basically you would have a lot of local autonomy. And secondly, Moscow was weak at that time, in the sense that was weak, and also Ukrainian Kazakh elite will have some advantages, because by that time they are much more educated, so to say, and they could play a leading role in this Russian Empire.
And just a few decades before, Sahaydachny almost burned down Moscow.
Yeah,
and
basically, yeah. But basically what I mean to say, the potential parallel was a role played by Scotch in building the British Empire, because they have the advantages. So they were not building English empire, they were building British empire. In the imagination of the Russian Cossack, the Ukrainian Cossack, this was the same way. They were thinking they're paving the way to their own empire.
And that's my next question, and very good that you raised this topic.
Which was very tragic decision in the final end.
Yeah, so Ukrainians from Khmelnytsky to Teofan Prokopovich were having this naivete that they can actually project themselves into this empire, and there is some reproaches that they created, like people like Teofan Prokopovich during the times of Mazepa created intellectually this empire, to which I'm actually very skeptical to this idea. But do you think that throughout many, many centuries of Ukrainian history we had this naivete with regard to Russia? So we were thinking that we can somehow influence Russia, form it according to our conceptions, be it in a kind of a federation with Russia or something like that.
So this is exactly the point, and you made it very explicitly, that the idea of Ukrainians was some kind of federal solution. First, Ukraine plus Russia, but then a federal Russian empire, especially in the 19th century, because basically it was not, Ukraine was not trying to separate from the Russian Empire, but trying to negotiate within the Russian Empire.
Yeah, it was not Drahomanov's great idea.
For Shevchenko, Kyiv, because the idea of Ukraine independence came very late, and mostly outside of Russian Empire, in the Austrian Empire. Because before that, until 1917, the main threat to Ukrainian political thought was a federalism, not independence, so to say, because they really believed that they could reshape this empire. Being the second largest group within the Russian Empire, they could turn Russia in some kind of federative European state with political rights, so to say. Probably naively, because nowadays with a hindsight, we have a hindsight of history, we could say it's past, this was naive, but still, this was their point. And I would say it's even in the 1920s, you have the kind of the establishment of the communist regime. This is mostly Ukrainian national communists who are trying to reframe the Soviet Union as a kind of communist federative state. And they daily believe that this will be European communist state, not Russian communist state, because basically they believed, like Mykola Khmelnytsky, that the center of the future communist state will not be Moscow but Berlin. And this is they were just starting that, but one way or another. This is exactly, I believe, this constant threat in Ukrainian political thought, this kind of negotiation within the Russian Empire and then within the Soviet Union. You could guess it was naive, but also it was very much pragmatic until then, because they was biding their time and waiting for a time, and if not the crisis, because basically, again, I would say that collapse of empire doesn't come from the periphery. Collapse of empire comes from the center. If not, the fighting for the power in the center between Yeltsin and Gorbachev on the one side and the former communists on the other side, all the kind of crisis, I don't know whether Ukraine would really get the chance to proclaim their independence. But still, what I'm trying to say that with a kind of the exception of a segment of Ukrainian elites, which were mostly outside of Russian control, like in the Austrian Empire, like in the war Poland, like diaspora, majority of Ukrainian elites were still trying to negotiate this empire rather to leave it.
And here comes my last question, and I would like to come back to what we began with. We were talking about the re-imperialization of the world, an attempt of Russia to basically create a new world order that will be, again, very imperial, divided between several empires. What do we need to stop it, and what is Ukraine's role in this?
I don't quite able to quote it literally, but I do remember the German President Weizsäcker of the 40th anniversary of the end of the Second World War said something to the fact that the bad thing that happened to Germany, that it lost the war. So this is exactly, we have to bring the current Russian regime to collapse, and then we could probably start again to reform Russian empire, Russian state, and to put a much more pressure, like it was in 1917 or 1981. I don't believe that Russia could reform itself by itself, so to say. There must be some pressure put inside. By the way, I believe also this is also the case in Ukrainians. Ukrainians could not be successful without the kind of the pressure from outside. But still, I believe Ukraine much more significant progress in this case, in transformation of power, that Russia did, also because they have another historical track. Still, they track on democracy, even so it's kind of very chaotic democracy by default, very close to anarchy, but still, it's very much longer. It's much more than the Russian thing. But again, what I'm saying here, you cannot leave Russia as it is, because it was very dangerous, killing state, with aggression, all the kind of things. And if not, the West wouldn't understand it, may bring to some results. There is a lot of discussion how we define the West. A variety of thinkers. And I say that probably one of the best way to define the West, first of all, that this is the long-term project of emancipation, which is basically was born within the West. With all this kind of the limitations and kind of the violence, still was a long time emancipation. But also very importantly, West has something which is essentially important. It's able of self-reflection and self-criticism, of rethinking, so to say, and most of the rethinking of history. In most of the cases, the West are willing to accept, to confess this kind of crimes they did in the past, including to the colonies, former colonies, to say. I wish the same could be done with Russia. Because basically Russia says that, yes, or Putin says, we are very much like the West, we're doing the same what the West did. The difference is Putin refers to the worst cases. He omits the best cases. And because there was no self-reflection. I believe that the part of the decolonization, if you say, if you wish, of the Russian history is not just the bringing Russia to, say, kind of the Russian regime, to some kind of collapse, which is a must, but also help or to force, I know what is the term, a Russian politician intellectual to rethink their past in much more critical way. I believe it's also the part of Ukrainians have also challenged, but Ukrainians much more, in this sense, I believe much more efficient because they are much more open to that. So one way to another, I would say history matters. Our way we think about the history, our imagination of the history, how we think about the past is something very important. In many senses, you could name this as a war about history, about the way we think about the history. Because again, there are some kind of the connections between the past and the nowadays, not just both real, but the kind of how we think about it.
Yaroslav Hrytsak, thank you very much for this conversation.
It's a pleasure, always been a pleasure to talk with you.
This was a podcast explaining Ukraine by UkraineWorld, an English language media outlet about Ukraine run by Internews Ukraine. My name is Volodymyr Yermolenko. I am a Ukrainian philosopher, editor-in-chief of UkraineWorld and president of PEN Ukraine. My guest today was Yaroslav Hrytsak, one of Ukraine's leading historians and public intellectuals. His English language book, Ukraine, the Forging of a Nation, is a key reference work on Ukrainian history. Let me remind you that you can support our work on Patreon. Your contributions are vital as we rely heavily on crowdfunding. You can also help fund our volunteer trips to frontline areas of Ukraine where we support both civilians and soldiers. Donations are welcome via PayPal, or you'll find all the relevant links in the episode description. Thank you for listening. Stay with us and stand with Ukraine.